Welcome to you for this segment of the By the People dialogues on, this one's on liberty. And we have a very good panel. I've had the opportunity of sitting with them for about half an hour and watching how the conversation evolved. I've been asked to just kind of do a little bit of a setup on kind of how does dialogue and relationships and diplomacy fit into the broader themes. And as you can tell, I'm the director of the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy, so I should be able to define diplomacy relatively easily. However, it's not a very easy term to define. It's not international relations theory, which many of you may have had in college, and it's not foreign policy as it comes out of a White House, any White House. It's more the conduct, the implementation of that policy, hopefully based on some of those theories. And what it seeks to do is to address conflict. We all have conflict in our lives. Which movie do we go to? What do we have for dinner? If any of you have any personal relationships or children, or have ever been a child, you know what conflict is. So not every conflict ends up as a violent conflict. But what diplomacy tries to do is to resolve conflicts before they become violent, hopefully mitigate those conflicts that have escalated, and if it becomes a crisis, seeks to resolve it. Preferably, you do want to resolve conflicts before they become violent, but we are not always that lucky. What diplomacy seeks to do is to find the common ground, to find those shared spaces between the two sides, three sides, four sides, and to build out from that, not in a way that dismisses or ignores the roots of the conflict, but actually faces them squarely and discusses them candidly and tries to address why is this conflict and how can we move beyond it. In many ways, the role of the diplomat and those who work in diplomacy is to try to find options and opportunities, new ways of looking at the question and new ways of looking at the issues to see if there is a way out. And basically, there is one tool. My military colleagues have aircraft carriers and airplanes and guns and all sorts of things that go boom. What Professor Joe Nye once called the kind of power you can drop on your foot. Diplomacy really only has one tool, and that's building relationships. Not necessarily building friendships. You don't actually have to like the person on the other side. But you do have to learn how to understand that person as a human being with a narrative, with interests, with fears, and with hopes, and then figure out how to work forward. And while diplomacy is essentially state-to-state relations, it is practiced every day by non-state actors, by individuals, Track 2 diplomacy, Track 3 diplomacy, much of what USIP is dedicated to as their core mission. Our guests this morning are two people, as I said, I've had the opportunity to speak with them and listen to them mostly for the last 30 minutes, who come from very different sides of one of the most intractable conflicts that we have, and that is the conflict between Israel and Palestine. They are a very interesting pair. One has written a book, Words of My Father. The other has written letters to my Palestinian neighbors. And so they are clearly looking for this kind of dialogue. One is from Brooklyn and lives in Jerusalem. The other one is from Gaza and lives in Boston. I didn't actually ask them this very personal question, but there's about a generation's difference between them. And so they are coming at this deeply intractable, highly emotional long-running problem. We were trying to figure out what date to go back to, and coming at it from very different perspectives, but they come at it with a very shared common goal of how do we resolve this in a way that respects the needs, the equities, the interests of peoples on both sides, and they see it as a people's, not a state issue. So it is my pleasure and honor to introduce Yossi Klein Halevi from Jerusalem, and Yousef Bashir from Gaza, who will have this dialogue. We'll see. Somebody told us that we were actually supposed to solve the problem in the next 36 minutes. I think that's a little bit of a heavy burden, but I think perhaps we can see some of the common ground and some of the difficulties. So Yossi and Yousef, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yousef, would you like to begin?
It's yours.
Yes. Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Excuse me. I'm at the tail end of a 3-month book tour, so I hope my voice will hold out. The Palestinian-Israeli conflict, Palestinian-Israeli tragedy, is, first of all, a conflict over two competing narratives, two opposing views of history, of justice, of belonging, of identity, of grievance, of dreams. And the way in which we can begin to solve this conflict and lead us to a point where both peoples will have national sovereignty is to begin the process of listening to each other's narratives and respecting the innate presence, the indigenousness of two peoples and two narratives.
Well, hello, everyone. Yossi. I've met many Israelis before, but this is the first and most special one because it's happening on tape in front of people. So I know it's going to be memorable for me, and I look forward to learning from you.
I do too. Reciprocally.
I grew up in Gaza. My family has lived in Gaza for hundreds of years, and ever since the first day I began to process meanings and words and concepts, I was always told that Jews, Christians, and Muslims all have legitimate claims to the land, and they need to figure out how they can share the cake of the Holy Land. And this is what I've been passionate about my entire life, and this is what brings me today to speak with Yossi. Despite knowing that there are some things I will not agree to, but this is what is necessary if we are to move forward, and conversations of such nature have got to become even more and more and more so we can go on with our lives as two peoples.
Well, Yousef, I feel really privileged to be sitting here and having a conversation with you. I just finished your book late last night on the 1 a.m. train to Washington.
Sorry about that.
And it was terrific. And I feel that when we met, we embraced, because we've both read each other's books. And there was really this feeling of, first of all, I think the camaraderie of authors. We've actually managed to tell our stories in print. We've actually managed to write it. And beyond that, I feel that when I read you, I felt that I found my Palestinian neighbor whom I've been seeking. And you and I share a very dangerous quality, a dangerous trait, which is curiosity. We both have curiosity about the other. And I felt that very strongly in your book, a curiosity about who are these Israelis who are occupying my home, And that's a very rare trait. And when I say that you and I share curiosity, I spent a year in the late 1990s going into Palestinian society as a religious Jew with my kippah, going into mosques and asking Muslims to teach me how you pray, teach me how you experience God's presence, and asking people to tell me their narratives. How does this conflict look through Palestinian eyes? And that became the basis of a book that I published about 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. And in this book, I'm trying to explain to my Palestinian neighbor who I am, who my people is, and how this conflict looks through Israeli eyes. And I see my book as an invitation to my Palestinian neighbor to resume this conversation. Tell me what it's like for you living under occupation, just as I feel the need to tell you what it's like living under a feeling of siege and denial of my story, my people's right to exist. And I feel that the only way that we can really begin to break this impasse is, first of all, having the human contact, and secondly, reading each other's stories, listening to each other's stories, whether we agree or disagree. And again, I think we both experienced reading each other's books, multiple disagreements. There were many times when I was reading your story and I said, but wait, there's a wider context. You're missing this point. But I have to honor your story. It's your story. It's how you experience this conflict. And even if we disagree with each other's narratives, and we will constantly disagree, we need to keep figuring out how, first of all, to keep listening to each other and to move toward a two-state solution in which there will be dignity, safety, mutual respect for both peoples.
Two-state solution. I've read your book too, and almost everything you've just said about my story, I can say in some instances, and someone in the audience was getting my feedback about your story, Jonathan. Some instances and some situations and some things, a lot of them were disputable to me, but that wasn't the big question. Whether the big question to me was how genuine and how sincere you telling me and taking the time to write the book and share it, hopefully with Palestinians and many others as well. And I appreciate that, because this is what I've been hoping to do, and this is what I've been hoping to see, that people will take the time to and the effort to share what they think and how they view the world and how they go about their business and why they do such and such and such, because otherwise you leave it up to me and perhaps someone else who you might not like, and they might not like you for whatever reason, and you deprive me from knowing who you are and learning about you. Palestinians, I'm sure they also want to read your story. But the reality is, many of them will not get to come here. Maybe perhaps will not get to get your book in their bookstores in Gaza or in the West Bank. And we need to create the environment and where we are able to sit down together and speak and share our stories. I don't have the same, I'm here, I'm privileged and I'm lucky to be here, but I feel that the majority of my people are not in the same position that I'm in, where they can leave freely, move around freely. I'm sure that's easy for you to share and express their ideas, who they are, because it's important for us to share our story, so you can find it in your heart to be possible and realistic to see my human side of this conflict. Because at the end of the day, we are cousins, whether we like it or not.
So, Yousef, I would like to propose a business arrangement. I will serve as your agent in Israel. I will work hard to get your book published in Hebrew. And my book has been translated into Arabic and is offered for free downloading. And if you would be my agent and help get my book to Palestinian audiences, and then let's see where we take this. Let's see how we do speaking to each other's audiences, and really trying to move past the point of a zero-sum game where one narrative has to defeat the other narrative in order to be true. And that's how we've been fighting this war for the last 70 years. This war has multiple fronts. And one of the fronts is the war of narratives. And when I first published this book and I posted on Facebook and announced this book, I got hundreds of responses from Jews, from Palestinians, from pro-Israel Christians, from pro-Palestinian Jews. And there was a common theme among many of these responses, excuse me, which is the other side doesn't really exist. Not that the other side is wrong. You don't exist. You're not a real people. I would get posts from right-wing Jews saying letters to my Palestinian neighbor. There's no such thing as Palestinians. It's an invented identity. And I would get posts from anti-Zionists saying, you Israelis, you're not a real people. You're not a real nation. The Jews, you're a religion. You're not a people. And so what very often happens in this conflict is that each side tries to define the other side out of its national identity. And so this is a conflict on multiple levels, on the human level, first of all, but also very much on the national level. And so when I speak about two narratives and of creating space for our two conflicting narratives, and there's nothing harder than creating space for two conflicting narratives in an existential life and death conflict, where both sides conceive of this conflict as life and death. That's what makes this so painful. But what I so much appreciate about your book and about who you are, and I really feel like I know you, Yousef. I feel like we've been friends for a long time. I feel that the human basis can be the beginning of listening to painful narratives of the other, even when everything that we know about this conflict shouts out, no, you got it wrong. But still, we have to somehow take a deep breath and listen. And again, I took lots of deep breaths reading your book, and I imagine the same was true for you reading me. So that's, for me, the foundation for peace is somehow trying to make peace between two conflicting narratives. And I'm not asking Palestinians to accept my narrative, but I am asking you to know that this is my narrative. It's my identity. Israel is my being. It's not political. It's my essence as a Jew. And I need to respect the same in you. And so when I get these emails from right-wing Jews saying, there's no such thing as Palestinians, it's an invented identity, my response is, of course it's an invented identity. Every people is an invented identity. Every people is an identity, a national identity, that's created. And that's true for every nation in the world. It evolves. People at some point decide they have more in common with each other than not, and they move from families to tribes to nations. We are at the stage now in this conflict where both peoples are at a dead end. And if we don't start acknowledging that each of us has the right to define ourselves, then there'll never be peace. And I would say, and this is really the last point in this, in this line of thinking, which is that the prerequisite for self-determination for both peoples is for both peoples to respect the right of the other to self-definition, to national self-definition.
Thank you, Yossi. You are speaking of something that I very much agree with, but again, we are trying to have a human conversation, are we not? But I am here, and you are here in so many ways. And I'm supposed to have that conversation, you know. I'm here and you're here, and we are trying to have that human conversation. I need to be your equal in so many ways in order for us to have that genuine, honest, successful, hopefully, conversation that will save both our lives in the future and sustain us in the Holy Land. But it is, you are a sovereign nation. I believe my side, whether I agree with how they went about it or not, they recognize the state of Israel. Whether they meant it, whether they didn't, I see, and I look over my shoulder and I see my people to be stateless. And it's been 70 years. I will never blame my people for being stateless. No one will ever do that to themselves. But in order for us to have this conversation, we must come to the same level. And it's hard for me to do because I'm denied so many simple, basic rights. This is me preaching and speaking my passions for peace while being, dehumanized, called names, terrorists, responsible for the failure of so many peace efforts, not allowed to go through airports. It's just too much for me. And I stay patient because I'm optimistic that one day I will meet someone from the Israeli side who will sit down like this and listen to my story. And I told you earlier, I'm glad that it's your generation. That is someone from your generation, if I may say generation, is going about this and saying we need to have a conversation. Because it is your generation, in my view, that set the stage for what we have today on the Israeli, at least on the Israeli side. You went to Gaza. You say you went to Gaza to visit, but you also have to understand what it feels like to a Palestinian when they hear you saying, I went to Gaza to visit. The first question they will ask you, were you just visiting as a tourist?
No.
And that is, you need to be, I want you to be able to express that. I want to hear it because when you do that, it shows me how truly empathetic you are and how you truly feel about what it felt like to go under occupation. And I want to know, because I appreciate in the story to know, wow, a soldier came to Gaza and went out of his way and to meet an imam in Nusayrat refugee camp to learn about our community. We have to be able to tell the story as it is because it's a beautiful story, whether you see it or not. But we have to be able to recognize that, yes, I was a soldier there. Yes, my creation meant your disaster. Yes, and you have to be comfortable with that. You're not saying anything wrong, but to me as a Palestinian, the side you're trying to communicate with, you have to tell your story in their language. And many of the people that got to listen to my story, I said it, and they come to me afterwards and said, it's like you're Jewish. And it makes me feel like, oh, okay, so I told my story because if you want to tell me my story, you have to put on my clothes, you have to put on my shoes, and then I will truly, truly, truly not only listen to you and hear you, I will embrace your story as well. It will become a part of mine as well.
So thank you. Thank you for those words, Yousef. And as I told you when we were sitting before coming on stage, I was a soldier in Gaza. I write this in my book. And I spent time at the intersection where your home is. And I know where your home is. And I know it as a soldier. So when I was reading your very, very painful account, painful for me as an Israeli, as a Jew, about your experience under occupation. I was there, literally there. And when I decided to return to Gaza about 8, 9 years later, after serving there as a soldier, as an occupier, I came to Gaza as a pilgrim to my neighbors' religious life, to my neighbors' suffering, to my neighbors' dreams. And this is what I was trying to understand, because I couldn't imagine confining my relationship with you to being your occupier. That I did not come home, and for me that's my language. My people did not come home, in my understanding, to deny another people its sense of home. And reading your book was agonizing, wrenching for me. So in that sense, I feel that one must speak truthfully, one must speak from that place of pain. But that place of pain for me as an Israeli is a very complicated place, because there are other parts of that pain. And part of that pain, again, is the very different ways in which we see how we got to this point. A normative Israeli understanding of how we got here is very different from a normative Palestinian understanding. And the normative Israeli understanding, is, as I know you know, is that Israel did try to end the occupation on a number of occasions. We had governments that really tried, not this government, for sure, but we did have governments in the past that tried, and those efforts failed. And I'm not mentioning this now to open up a debate, but to try to explain how most Israelis understand this moment. And if you look at the polls in Israel, you'll see a very strange pattern over, I'd say, the last 10 years. Ask Israelis, do you support a two-state solution? Up to 70%. Now it's getting lower. The despair is growing on both sides. I'd say the numbers now are probably about 60% yes to a two-state solution. Ask those same people, do you believe that a two-state solution will bring peace, or will a Palestinian state only continue the war against Israel's legitimacy? 80% will say it won't bring peace. And you can ask an Israeli, if we were to uproot every settlement tomorrow, would that bring peace? Most Israelis would say no. Now, again, I'm raising that to define the problem. And the problem is, how do you get the Israeli public, a majority of which says in principle yes to a two-state solution, and I think a majority of Israelis understand that it isn't good for Israel to be a permanent occupier. This is not good for Israel as a democratic state, as a Jewish democratic state. It's a disaster for Israel. So how do you get that majority of Israelis? How do you move them from being supportive of a two-state solution in principle to supportive in practice? And I look at the precedent of Anwar Sadat as an example. Sadat comes to Jerusalem and says, we accept you into the region, we accept your legitimacy. The key word that Israelis wait to hear from Arab leaders, and especially Palestinian leaders, is you have the right to exist. You are indigenous in this land, and we accept a Jewish majority state in part of this land. And I think that the first Palestinian leader who says that will find a majority of Israelis supportive. So now, that's on the Palestinian side. On the Israeli side, we have to stop building settlements. We have to start speaking a language not only of security, excuse me, of security and threat, but of peace and reconciliation, which this government seems incapable of speaking. And we need to start speaking as neighbors. And we did have leaders in the past on the Israeli side who were capable of that language. We don't have it today. I hope we will have it in the future. It's a lot to respond to.
Yes, I begin, I'm 29 years old. Everything, 48, 67, 73, 56, I've read it. There's the Arabic version, there's the Jewish version, there's the American version, there's, so many versions. And I have a big sense of what happened. For me, as a person, I start from, I was born in '89, I start from then. '89 was when Farther Rome, the settlement, was built behind my house.
I was drafted into the IDF in '89.
Post the first Intifada, which I did not see. And then we have the Oslo Accords, where Arafat, former enemy, if you will, becomes a peace partner, signs the Oslo Accords, and recognizes Israel as the state of Israel, and Israel recognizes us as, the PLO, as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. And I've seen a pattern of where we have shown good faith to come meet you halfway. Now, the Israeli narrative, when you say something like, when you say our offer for peace in 2000 was rejected, that's, to me, as someone who believes so much in the word itself, I take it, it hurts me. It hurts my feelings to know that a Palestinian leader had an opportunity to make peace and chose to reject it. How? So I go back and I research and I read and I see, not from Palestinian writers. I've lived in the West for 10 years now. It seems to me that the State of Israel offered us Gaza Strip, the West Bank, parts of east of Jerusalem, and with full security control of the West Bank and the things like Jordan Valley, the borders with Jordan, and bam, it's the Palestinians who didn't want peace. You have to see that I need to have full sovereignty just as you do. Today, I recognize, officially, we recognize the State of Israel, but the State of Israel does not recognize us as anything aside from, yes, there are Palestinians in the occupied, in the territories. They don't even refer to it as occupied. And I need to figure out a way to make the Israeli side get past that everything is their fault, everything is their fault, everything is their fault. I never sit as a Palestinian and I say, it's their fault. I know that my side is responsible for mistakes in this conflict. But at the end of the day, it shouldn't be, I'm not questioning your legitimacy. I'm only questioning when will I be given my rights, my basic human rights to exist as a human being, my own airports, my own borders, and whether it makes you safe or not, you have to figure that out on your own. And I'm here to help you because I am your neighbor. What beharms you beharms me too. And this is a conversation that has to continue, but I'm trying to figure out what I can do to help you, help your people understand that I'm not a threat and I shouldn't be denied. You talk about if we uproot all the settlements in the West Bank, will we have peace tomorrow? Whether we have peace tomorrow or not, something illegitimate and destroying the lives of my people shouldn't be a question or tied with will we have peace tomorrow or not. You should defend your home as anyone should. From your own home, you shouldn't invade me in order to say, okay, now we can be safe and now we can peace. I'm not going to attack you. I've said earlier, I've never read in any chapter in history of a Palestinian invasion of the State of Israel or any thing that we systematically did against the Jews. The Jews and the Palestinians lived for hundreds of years before the 48 at least. And I've read many, many stories about harmony and reconciliation and all of that. And it went even beyond Israel and Palestine. You take the example of Andalusia, a civilization flourished there, Jewish and Muslim. We need to get past, I feel there is a sense of politicizing, and even those of us who are trying to solve it, we succumb to the trick and the trap of politics of this conflict, and we need to be very, very cautious about that.
Thank you. Thank you. I bring up the Israeli narrative on why the peace process failed, not to revive the argument, because I know there is no way to win this argument for either side, because both sides see everything in opposite ways, from the current events on the Gaza border going back to 70 years ago. But I think that you know, you said a beautiful line before, that you're my neighbor and you want to help me try to reach peace. I'm your neighbor and I want to help you try to achieve national sovereignty and an end to occupation. And for that reason, I feel it's my responsibility to try to explain to Palestinians how Israelis understand this. Whether or not they're right, let's leave that aside. Maybe your version of why the year 2000, why the peace process failed in the year 2000 is right. Maybe not. Maybe the Israeli version is right. It's not. If it hasn't been resolved now, we're not going to resolve that. But the question is, what do we do with the perceptions on both sides? Which is to say that even Israelis like myself, who desperately want to end the occupation, for your sake and also for my sake, for the sake of my kids, I don't want my kids to be occupiers. I don't want my grandchildren to be occupying your children. So how do we get to the point where Israelis like myself who want to end the occupation feel that we can take the step and do it? And that means explaining, where each side needs to explain to the other what it needs. I hear you when you say you need full sovereignty. I need you to hear me when I say that my people needs to hear from your leaders that the war against my legitimacy is over. And I know from reading your book that you and your father, the family you come from, has no problem with this conversation. I need to hear this from your leaders. I need to hear it clearly, because so far, and if you tell me they've said it already, we're not hearing. We're not speaking the same language. And so we need to hear, when Anwar Sadat stood in the Knesset and he said, we accept you into this region, we accept your right to exist. That made an opening for a very suspicious Israeli public towards Sadat. Don't forget, Sadat had launched a surprise attack against Israel on Yom Kippur only 4 years earlier. And suddenly Sadat comes to Israel, and a majority of Israelis pressure the Israeli government into giving back all of Sinai. And that's the model that in some way I'm hoping we can adopt here.
Yeah.
And so what I need as an Israeli, who is in my own way, and I'm not comparing what you've gone through to what I've gone through, because yes, you're here and your people is here and my people is here. So how do we get to here? And I believe that the key is with each people hearing what the other needs for its basic sense of security. And what my people need is an intangible. It's not a tangible concession. It's not territory, it's words. We need to hear the words that the war against the Jewish right to self-determination is over. We accept that the Jews are a people, not just a religion. And when I speak to Palestinians, I hear this all the time. We have no problem with you as a religion, but we don't accept this nation idea. And that's the mirror image of right-wing Jews who tell Palestinians, well, you're just Arabs, you're not Palestinians. There's no such thing as a separate Palestinian identity. And that's why I keep coming back to narrative. That's why I feel that maybe peacemaking needs to begin with writers, with this kind of conversation, with people who love their story, but don't only love their story, are also curious to read other writers. I loved your book, as painful as it was for me, because I felt you were giving me a window into my neighbors, who I know only from today, only from the other side of a wall. And so I need to know you as a neighbor, and you as a writer give me that window.
And you will. I appreciate what you said about I need to hear it from your leaders.
And my leaders need to say the right words too, absolutely.
Thank you. We need to hear it from the people. The people choose the leaders. And the people's, what I see in Israel is, and you know what? In this situation, it's you who has to help me, because I am keeping my head above water, and I am reaching my hand to you so you can pull me out. And what the Israeli public, what the Israeli leaders do, make sure you don't pull me down with you, or make sure you recognize me first. But I am drowning, and I'm your neighbor. I mean, the word neighbor is holy. And that's important. The policies that are in Gaza, the policies in Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, what it means to the Palestinians now for the past 30 years, the policies in the West Bank, the checkpoints, the wall, the blockade, the imprisonments, once we do anything that doesn't please the Israeli public, the Israeli leaders, then let's slash their tax money. If they go to the UN, let's make more pressures. It can't. You have the tools. You have the state. You have the institutions. You have you have what it takes to build, not just to sustain your democracy, but to help others as well. And you need to start investing in your neighbors. It's not happening through soldiers. It's not going to happen through settlements. I know French Hill, to me, is not just to me, to the entire world, is illegal. 242, 383 says the 67 borders belong to the Palestinians. And to us, we look at it as a concession. We don't look at it, this is a demand that everyone said you need to accept, and if you want to move on with your lives. And we said, okay, even though we think that we have just the same claims to the entire land as the Jewish people and the Christians, we are fine with the 22%, including so many other complicated issues that will be solved within the 22%. But I'm not seeing, every year, I see celebrations on the Israeli government, and sometimes I see videos, not fake news. Trust me, I take serious effort to make sure that I am not just taken for a ride when someone is telling me a story. But I see such anger on the Israeli side towards my people, and I have a difficult time understanding where is this sophisticated hatred is coming from, because every time I went to a Jewish university, and it was always me being the optimistic side, always me. The Israeli side, who has a passport, can fly, can go, can apply, is never harmed anywhere, no, it's never going to happen. It's dangerous. It's this. You must, and I tell you this because I've seen who you are, I've explored you, and you know what? I loved you. You need to be courageous.
That's very mutual.
And
I love you
come
too.
to me too, because I am being destroyed. My future, I am in jeopardy. You're not. You've got tools to defend yourself. What do I have? my only war today to win is the war of peace. It's not any other war. You've won other wars. Good job. You used the word faith in your book. And I appreciate this word because it's the key to my belief that we will live in peace one day. I need to see the faith on the Israeli side. I don't see faith in me. I don't see faith in the peace process. I don't see faith in the international setup. I don't see faith in anyone that comes and says, you know, and you say about, and this is not to argue with you, but when you tell me that you're leaders, I need to hear it in words. When I ask for a state, when I ask for a full sovereignty, it shouldn't come off as attempting to, you know, make you illegitimate. I'm just asking for what is rightfully mine today, at least for the past 30 years. And it shouldn't come off as a threat. If I say uproot the settlement, it's not legal, it's legal, it's this, it's that, it shouldn't come off as an insult to you. You need to understand that if you were there 3,000 years ago, I was there 10,000 years ago. So the Israelis, I'm waiting for you to invest in the tools and invest in me, because if you invest in me, you're investing in the future of the Holy Land, which I'm sure you deeply, deeply care about.
Yeah. I think this was a terrific conversation, and I think we've seen how deep these roots are, how much narrative counts in conflict resolution. It is not facts, as I think was said. It's not the settlements per se, it's the legitimization, it's the recognition, it's the sense of security. So I think we've seen both what are the roots of this what is so far, I will say so far, been intractable. But I think we've also had the opportunity to see how a conversation between two people who legitimately respect each other, seem to actually legitimately like each other, and are willing to engage in what was a very tough conversation at a few points. How there is always the potential for a solution, regardless of how intractable it may seem at a particular moment. I want to give the audience an opportunity to ask some questions. We have run a little over. I would ask that you keep your question brief, and I would ask that you keep your question a question. And give first of all, give others in the audience the opportunity to also ask questions, and give our wonderful speakers the chance to answer you. So we'll take a few questions for a few minutes. Yes, sir.
Thank you for your time. Just quickly to put it in context.
If you can identify yourself.
Yeah, I'm a second-generation Israeli officer in the Israeli Armed Force, grandson to a Holocaust survivor and a grandfather who was born in Damascus. Extremely passionate about finding a solution. I think that most Israelis at this point have contextual empathy, which means if you want me to understand your pain, you have to understand our pain. And where the Palestinians sit right now, they don't have the luxury to have empathy, because every day is a fighting battle to survive.
Question?
And the question is for Yossi specifically. Instead of Yousef become your champion in Palestine and share your book, what can you do in Israel to find the empathy and understanding to close the gap between Yousef and his people are here and where we, my friend, my family, some other people in Israel sit right there?
So, as you know, Mizrahim, Jews from Muslim countries, tend to be the most fearful or wary of the Arab world, and well, this is we can have this conversation, but certainly in my experience, most are right-wing voters, and that's true. And so the question, and I think that there's a gap between the political and the cultural. Culturally, Mizrahim, or at least of an older generation, certainly feel in affinity with the Arab world. Politically, there's a great deal of anger and fear, anger also from their uprooting, their grandparents' experience. And so I think that, that you're right, that it's always easier for the more powerful side to feel nuance. But the question is, why don't more Israelis feel nuance? Why don't they open themselves up to it? In the 1990s, during at least the beginning of the Oslo years, there was the beginning of that process in Israel. You felt it. You felt Israelis beginning to ask the question, who are the Palestinians? How do they experience this? And we had the phenomenon of a whole new generation of Israeli historians beginning to rewrite the history and incorporating the Palestinian narrative. So, but the Second Intifada is really the turning point in shutting Israelis down and in creating this deep, deep fear. And when Israelis look around their borders today, we have Iran building bases in Syria. We have Hezbollah. There's Hamas. On almost every border, there are enclaves, entities that are committed to Israel's disappearance. And that has had a deep impact on the Israeli soul. And what we need are more conversations like this. And when I say to you, Yousef, that I am ready to be your agent in Israel, I mean that. I'm ready to be your literary agent and find you a publisher and help bring you to Israeli audiences to have exactly these kinds of conversations.
Ma'am?
Hi. Laura Cutler, American University Center for Israel Studies. In a lot of ways, I feel this has been a very careful conversation. You all talked about, there was an example of Sadat and how he came to the Knesset. You're, in a sense, doing grassroots, trying to change minds on the ground of people. Given the importance of leadership in making sometimes difficult decisions and having to bring their people with them, how realistic is a solution given the current leadership on all sides, and is there something that you envision that could change to bring that about?
Okay, I think that Yousef and I are we're only writers. You know, I'm not a politician, and all that I feel I can do is try to help model a potential conversation for peace. And that means coming from the starting point where Yousef and I will disagree about almost all of, we don't even agree with what the facts are. And that creates a tremendous abyss. But we share a common goal. We want this to end. We don't want history to continue to have veto power over the future. And so how do we model a conversation where we can disagree with each other? Because I think that that's a crucial part of when Israelis and Palestinians finally start speaking. We're going to discover that we disagree about almost everything. And yet, how do we continue to stay in the conversation while we disagree about it? And I don't feel that this was a careful conversation at all. I think that in everything that was said here, I think both of us felt everything that was also unsaid. We understand that each of us was really, in some sense, speaking shorthand. And there are decades and decades of anger and grievances and fear. And how do we hold that? Because that's not going away. Yeah. How do we hold it and get to the point where the situation isn't like this, but like this?
I think, unfortunately, in this day and age, we mistake civil conversation for careful conversation. I don't think they were being careful. They were being that old-fashioned thing called civil. And so we just need to kind of remember that. And Yousef, you get the last word.
Thank you for your question. On February 18, 2004, I was 15 years old, and suddenly and without cause, in front of 3 Americans and my parents, I was shot and paralyzed in the spine by an Israeli soldier. This experience, many people would think that it would transform me to be an angry, hateful person seeking revenge. But what you might be surprised by, that this experience actually brought me not only closer to the idea of Israel and what it means and its claim to the land, which I had to respect, but also brought me closer to the values and ideas of my father that challenged me every single day on always going, bypassing their occupation, bypassing their blockades, bypassing their whatever policies that I don't disagree with, and only focus on their human image. Because this will not only save the peace process ultimately, but will also save my sanity and my humanity. And it's my ultimate defeat if I ever wake up one day and I am no longer feeling a human. For me, it's my real and ultimate battle, is to never ever lose my humanity to anger, politics, you name it. And thank you everyone for listening to us today, and we hope to come back next year to have another conversation like this.
And what I would recommend, this conversation, it went on for half an hour before we came in. It's been very rich and illuminating. To say that they only do words and they only write books, I think, is, you're not giving yourself credit for the power of the word and the power of the author. I am going to act as the literary agent for both of them, and recommend that you, if you are interested in this and how this kind of dialogue can move forward, that you buy both their books and read both of them, because I think they pair together particularly well on this issue of narrative, relationship, dialogue, reaching out, and ultimately solution. So I am now the agent for both of these gentlemen.
Thank you.
So thank you all for your
very much.
attention.